Well, hello, and welcome to another episode of Obstacle Talk. My name's Linda Honey, and I am with Protected at Work. Today, I have the pleasure of introducing Ken Fichtler, who's both the CEO and I believe the founder, correct, of Gaize.
Correct.
So, Ken, welcome to the show today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, it's great to have you. You and I have talked at length and got your product and all of that, but I think it'd be helpful to the audience to have some background about you and kind of who you are and how you got to this before we really get into our topic of employers, how employers are responding to legal cannabis with the impairment and drug test, all those things. So please.
Yeah. My origin story is kind of an interesting one. I got into this because I was the Director of Economic Development for the state of Montana. And in that role, I was charged with understanding, various things and how they would impact the state economy and improving businesses' opportunity in the state. And so one of the things that I ended up studying in that role was whether or not recreational cannabis would be a good thing or a bad thing for the state economy. And it looked like it would probably be a positive, but I was cautioned by the law enforcement officers and some of the businesses and economic developers in states that had already legalized that there was no device to check for active impairment. And that really struck me as not only a huge safety problem, but a big market opportunity as well. And so when my job was over and our governor was termed out, I thought this looked like the most interesting and important problem that I had identified. And so I jumped in and decided to solve it. Prior to that, I've worked in some technology businesses. I've started a couple companies, and most recently, prior to the government role, was the director of marketing for an infrared optics manufacturing business.
Very diverse then to get to this place that... Right?
It's funny, though, how all my experiences have sort of really lended themselves to understanding what I'm doing now and, having built, I think, the best product to identify active cannabis impairment is sort of every experience I've had has been useful in getting me here.
That's good. That's great. I love it. Well, tell me, how are you seeing... right? Especially because you mentioned being involved with law enforcement. How are you seeing that legal cannabis has changed things for employers?
Yeah, I mean, it's been a real challenge, I think, for employers because you're going from a situation in which you can simply detect THC in an employee and say, well, that's not against, that violates our rules, and you can fire that person. Whether or not everybody was doing that is a different story, of course, but that, was a paradigm that you could adopt. And now under legal cannabis, you can't really tell someone that they can't go use a legal product, or at least it's much, much more difficult. And so for employers, when they start to look at their drug testing policies and how those need to change in response to legal cannabis, they're really left in a very difficult position because they have to make some decision between, do we try to keep our employees from using what is now a legal product, or do we maintain a safe workforce? And that's really a decision that I don't think employers should have to make. And so what needs to be created and what we've created at Gaize is this real-time impairment detection product, much in the same way that you can detect active impairment from alcohol by using a breathalyzer. You need some way to detect active impairment from cannabis in order to maintain a safe workforce with legal cannabis. And I think that's really how employers are starting to think about it, and where leaders are starting to deploy energy and time and capital into solving that problem.
I would absolutely agree with you on that. So in your opinion, then, just simple THC drug testing is no longer sufficient, or in some cases, California comes to mind, that it's not even legal anymore to drug test for marijuana, correct?
Exactly. Yeah. California Assembly Bill 2188 comes into effect at the end of, or I think it's January 24. And that'll preclude employers from simply testing for THC and taking adverse action against their employees if they find it. And the reason that is a law that California has adopted and some other states have done, sort of similar things, is that THC lingers in the body for a really long time after it was last used. And so whereas you can measure alcohol and say, okay, based on our understanding of how alcohol works in the body, at 0.08 is too drunk to be driving for, almost everyone. And so with cannabis, you cannot simply look at THC in the body because it lingers for so long. And so you can actually detect THC for up to a month after it was last used. Depending on the test you're using, there's several tests. There's urine, blood, breath, hair, saliva is the other one. And each of those has sort of a detection window that you can identify THC in. And the important thing is that for all but potentially breath, the detection window is much, much longer than the impairment window. So you will be detecting THC long after someone was impaired. And so you don't want to be firing employees who got high on the weekend, for example. And that is very much what's happening now with people THC testing employees and taking adverse action. So that's why, businesses are really looking at, some businesses have dropped THC testing entirely, which really exposes them to unsafe work environments. And others are trying to understand, what do we do in this changing environment?
You mentioned impairment window or detection windows versus impairment, right?
Yeah.
Tell me about that. Tell me what you know about that.
Yeah, so for each testing type, I listed them previously. They each have a window in which you can detect THC. And so a good example is saliva, where the window in which you're actually impaired on cannabis, depending on how you use it, is typically something like an hour and a half, 2 hours. For edibles, it's longer. But for smoked and vaped cannabis, it's about 90 minutes is kind of your peak impairment window. And then your detection window for a saliva test or an oral fluid test is going to be about 48 hours. And so it's significantly longer that you can detect the presence of THC. And so that, obviously creates a problem when you want to say you're not allowed to be high at work, of course, but now we're, sort of policing your off time if we're using an oral fluid test to detect THC. Someone could have used cannabis the night before and be completely sober, and then you detect THC and take adverse action at work. That's a pretty unfair thing. So what we really need to do is understand, how does cannabis impact the body and how can we measure that? And so that's what we've done at Gaize.
I like it. And just as a side note, you mentioned like even urine drug testing being up to 30 days or longer, right? I've had experience having owned a drug testing company in the past where we had people test positive on a urine drug screen for 3.5 up to 4.5 months after they'd last used. Just trivia, because I know a lot of people talk about that 30 days and that's not true anymore, which I think you would agree has to do with how strong THC is now, right? The products.
It's gotten radically stronger. THC back when these tests were created was something like 6% was kind of the highest THC you could get. Now you're looking at 30% THC. And so it's just a radically different product than it used to be. And it interacts with the body differently and lingers in the body in different ways. THC is incredibly lipophilic, which means it binds to fat cells in the body, and then metabolites are released over time. And so when you're doing a urinalysis screening in particular, these high-potency THC products will linger for longer in the body just by virtue of there being more THC in the product.
Well, right. And you mentioned edibles. Right?
Mm-hmm.
An edible that's 5 or 10 milligrams of THC, right? And a serving size being one of those. To go back to your 6% from way back then.
Yep.
But so many people are not just eating one serving. So
absolutely. Yeah, I think we probably all know people that can eat, several servings and continue to function in with a dose that would knock most people out. So that's it's a real challenge for these THC and THC metabolite drug tests. And that's something that, I don't think that the law has caught up to in most places. California is an anomaly in that they have really created some worker protections for THC. There are a couple other states. New Jersey has done something sort of similar. Montana, where I am, actually has done something sort of similar, but California's is definitely the most robust so far. But I anticipate that other states will look at that and adopt something similar.
I agree. I think you're right. I think people overall are at a loss. What do we do?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So in comes Gaize, hopefully. And Ken,
this is
you might not know this. I can't speak to it even with my past experience, but if somebody, say a THC candy bar,
Mm-hmm.
10 servings, 10 milligrams per serving, so 100 milligrams.
Mm-hmm.
If somebody ingests 100 milligrams, as you say, put some people out, right?
Yeah.
Will they test longer on your device on Gaize, or do you know that?
We do know that. So edibles are really interesting. They metabolize in there's a different metabolic pathway for edibles than there is for smoked cannabis. And so the impairment window for edibles is much longer. Typically they take about an hour to 2 hours to even set in. And then your impairment window is going to be something between 4 and 6 hours for sort of a normal dose. For these large doses though, let's take the use case, the person who doesn't consume a lot of cannabis and then, maybe accidentally consumes a lot on an edible, they're going to be, potentially high for over, 12 hours. I've heard of people being high for a day. So yeah, these high dose THC sort of situations can lead to very, very long impairment windows for edibles in particular. Cannabis is also interesting, I'll note, in that it has a very high, people develop tolerance to THC and do so really quickly. And so one of the effects that's very challenging for THC testing is when you're looking at the amount of THC in the body, that amount of THC does not impact everyone in the same way. So someone with a high tolerance for THC can consume a dose that would put most people on the couch and be totally functional. Whereas, someone who uses THC very infrequently could use some of this high dose or high potency THC and end up, virtually comatose from that. So it's a real challenge and very much more present in THC than it is in alcohol. Everyone's heard of high functioning alcoholics, and these are people that can consume alcohol and do consume alcohol and function normally. That phenomenon is much, much more common in cannabis than it is in alcohol. There are people that smoke cannabis every day as soon as they wake up, multiple times throughout the day, and that's sort of their baseline. I mean, they operate at that state. But they're always going to have more THC in their body than, would be above the legal limit in some states that have established that. So states like Nevada, where you are, and Montana have established legal limits for the amount of THC in the body, and those are fundamentally nonsensical because there's just no science at all that backs up the idea that some amount of THC equals impairment.
Sounds about right.
Yeah.
Don't want to bash either of our states, but I'll go with you there. But staying on that, so somebody that has developed a tolerance, right, because that is what happens.
Yeah.
Are they going to test or show signs of impairment when they're functioning like that?
Most often, no. If they're at a state where they are, they have consumed cannabis, but they're not, they're not impaired. And there's lots of evidence to show that people with high tolerance can consume cannabis and not be impaired. Or they don't display the same signs of impairment. They perform well on driving simulators, for example. Those people would not show as impaired unless you are sort of too impaired to be driving on Gaize. Our product is really tuned to detect the signs of impairment that manifest in the eyes, and these are the same signs that cops have been looking for 45 years. So what we've done is we've taken the Track My Finger tests that cops have done, and we have programmed those to run on a VR headset. And we do those automatically. We capture eye movement data throughout the process. Then we use machine learning to detect the same signs and symptoms of impairment that law enforcement have been looking for. And so if those signs and symptoms are present, then you are sort of deemed by law enforcement and by our product to be too impaired to be driving or too impaired to be operating machinery. And so that's what we report.
So let's continue on that then with Gaize. Is it specific to marijuana, or does Gaize show something more than that? Like, are you saying that with your device it is marijuana, or are you saying that, hey, this is something we need to take a look at your person?
Yeah, that's a great question and an incredibly important and nuanced conversation. So I started Gaize to tackle this marijuana challenge. And in order to do that, we did the world's largest clinical trial on cannabis impairment that's ever been done. So what we did with that data is we basically looked for the signs and symptoms of impairment that we thought would exist based on what law enforcement looked for. And we found those. And so when we were done with that, we took the product one step further and we said, well, we may as well find all the signs and symptoms of impairment that law enforcement look for. And so we captured some small amount of alcohol data and some other data, and we programmed our product to recognize the signs and symptoms of impairment for every type of impairment that manifests in the eyes we look for and we report. We do not tell our customers whether or not someone is impaired on cannabis or impaired on alcohol or impaired on any other drug. We tell you that there's abnormal eye movement happening, essentially. And so based on that abnormal eye movement that's happening, you can know with relative confidence that there's something going on here that is not normal and that you should investigate further. And the idea really is that from there, you would probably lean on a classical drug test to verify the presence of a substance. So if you were concerned about cannabis, you probably want to do an oral fluid test, maybe a breath test when those are available. And based on that, you could say, okay, you're showing signs of impairment in your eye movement, you're showing THC in your breath or saliva. Based on this, we can make a confident decision that you're actively impaired. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It cut out just for a split second there. So the last part you said that with the eye movement, with the breath and or oral fluid test, then you could confirm that, like, look, there's impairment now. Correct?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But
and
we don't
stay
want
on that.
Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, go ahead. No, you go first.
I was going to say we don't want to be, at least at this juncture, in the business of telling people that you're impaired on some class of substance. That's sort of future state technology that we think our product can get there, but there's some legal ramifications of doing so that we're not ready for that yet. We need more data. We need more refinement of the product. Right now, what we can very accurately do is detect these signs and symptoms of impairment and report that there's abnormal eye movement happening.
Is it fair to say that the abnormal eye impairment or the abnormal eye movement, we teach reasonable suspicion as well, and we talk about that sometimes there's signs and symptoms exhibited that aren't necessarily drug or alcohol. Is it fair to say that your device may be something that can help with fitness for duty and right? Maybe it's medical, maybe maybe it's something else. Is that
definitely.
A fair statement?
And that's a really important point too. We're right now working to understand how various other impairment modalities impact eye movement. And so, for example, we're capturing data on Parkinson's patients, and so we can understand what does Parkinson's look like in the eye. We're not going to report that someone could have Parkinson's, but we're going to report that this is abnormal. And that really gets to this idea of fitness for duty and whether or not someone is actually fit for doing the job that they're assigned to do. We don't really care as Gaize what the reason that someone is impaired is. And what we talk to our customers about is that it doesn't really matter on your end either. What we want to know is, can you do this job correctly and safely? And that's really I think the paradigm that most businesses are starting to think about, and where we're encouraging people to move towards.
100%, which is protected at work, right?
Yeah.
Like that workplace safety.
Exactly.
Giving employers the best tools that they can have to make sure that their workforce is safe. And once we have, again, you and I have had this discussion, this is a screening tool. This is something that we go, somebody's got some sort of observations. We go, okay, wait, now what? Maybe in comes Gaize. Some failed tests, right? And maybe you could speak to how it reports, and then on to the next steps. Is it medical? Is it a drug and alcohol test? Whatever. But can maybe talk about the tests that are actually run? Yeah,
I'll talk through the tests that we do. So we basically have taken the drug recognition expert eye test. And so this is a series of 6 tests that was developed by National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, the International Association of Chiefs of Police, and the LAPD back in the 80s. And so they took these tests that cops have been doing for a long time and formalized them, did a big study, and really created this very prescriptive way that the tests are done so that they're repeatable and you get consistent results out of them. And so what we basically did is we took the training manual for the drug recognition expert eye tests and we programmed it to run in our product. That's our headset there.
Nice.
So that takes about 6 minutes. Those tests take about 6 minutes to conduct in their entirety. We start each test with a calibration, so that makes sure that our eye tracking sensors are aligned to the person's eyes. And we also do a couple different checks. We look for whether or not they have unequal pupil size, which could indicate a head injury or some other reason that you wouldn't want someone to go through the test. And we also look for equal tracking, which is whether or not the person can equally track the stimulus on the screen with both eyes at the same time. Not being able to do that can be indicative of a medical problem or potentially a head injury, or we've actually had people try to do the test with prosthetic eyes, and that doesn't work either. So from there, we move into the lack of smooth pursuit test, where we look at whether or not your eyes can track a stimulus smoothly. And in that case, a jerky eye movement would indicate that there's some abnormality going on. We report a fail for that. Then we move to the horizontal gaze nystagmus tests, starting with HGN at max deviation. And so we look at whether or not your eye exhibits nystagmus at the left and right peripheries of vision. And nystagmus is an involuntary twitching of the eye. So we look for that characteristic waveform, basically, of how your eye is moving, and we report that as a fail if it's present. Then we do horizontal gaze nystagmus with onset prior to 45 degrees, and that's the same test but done at 45 degrees from center. So at higher levels of impairment, that'll start to manifest. Then we do vertical gaze nystagmus, which looks at whether or not your eye exhibits nystagmus at the vertical periphery. Then we do lack of convergence, where we bring a stimulus towards the bridge of your nose and see if you can cross your eyes and hold them in that position. And the last test we do is pupillary rebound dilation, and that's a test that has 3 different light levels: room light, full black, and then bright light simulating a flashlight in the eyes. We do all 3 light levels, and basically what we look for is abnormal pupil size and abnormal response to light. So we look at how your eye is dilating in the full black, how it constricts when exposed to light, and whether or not there's any oddities there. And so each of these tests is really designed to elicit the signs and symptoms of impairment for specific classes of drug. And depending on, sort of which tests you pass or fail, you can start to hone in on the class of drug someone could be impaired on.
I love that. And again, so the user is not maybe a drug user or whatever, but the person administering the test is going to see that pass fail then.
Correct. Yeah. So they see that pass fail with, yeah, exactly. It takes about 30 seconds for our algorithms to evaluate the test results, and then they see that pass fail immediately. We also record video, which is a really important piece. So in a worst case, if an employer was sued, or if they wanted to have a human validate that this was accurate, we have video that's recorded from, just a couple centimeters from the eyeball. It's very, very clear what's going on. And so you can have a human expert look at that video and say, yeah, here in the video we see horizontal gaze nystagmus at max deviation. That's characteristic of depressant or alcohol impairment. So that's a really useful piece of evidence for law enforcement, of course, but also for businesses as they look a little further out and make sure that they're covered legally.
And you're segueing right into what I wanted to ask you next. The legalities of this, right? Eye nystagmus and tests like that haven't really been written into most people's drug and alcohol policies.
Yeah.
So what are you guys doing with that?
Yeah, it's a great question. Each state right now is legal to use our product as a screening tool. We do not currently allow our customers to use Gaize as the only tool that they would use to take adverse action against an employee. And that's, as I said, this is these tests. There are reasons you could fail these tests that are not due to drug or alcohol impairment. And we need to understand what those are, but you don't necessarily want to be taking adverse action if someone is having a medical event or something like that. And so we require follow-up drug testing, but we've got a law firm called Ogletree Deakins that's one of the nation's largest and most well-respected employment law firms. they work with each of our customers to ensure that they're deploying Gaize legally, that their policies are updated effectively, and answer any questions that might come up. So that's been a really wonderful addition as well. But yeah, Gaize is legal to use today as a screening tool for all 50 states.
That's great. Well, and right back to it, a lot of companies across the nation use instant drug tests, right?
Yep.
Whether it's an oral fluid or a urine test. And so again, one more tool for the employers' toolboxes.
Yeah.
And this is not just for employers. This is that employees are also having their rights protected in the states that this is legal, which is
absolutely
a lot of states now.
I think this is an incredibly important point that I'd like to double click on. When employees start using cannabis, they're currently almost certainly are in a position where they are taking a lot of risks with their job. And so what really needs to happen is, there should be demand from the employees' side that, hey, you should be deploying a product like Gaize to verify that we're ready to work when we show up and we're not, being penalized for what we did over the weekend. We're seeing a lot of customers that are really, I think, understanding that and wanting to maintain their workforce. I mean, we had a customer come to us recently that had just had to fire an employee because they bumped a forklift into a box or whatever and ended up having to do a drug test, and that the employee came back positive for cannabis. And they were like, we know he wasn't high at work. He was a great employee. We had to fire him because that was our policy. That's a terrible outcome for everybody. They lost a great employee. The employee lost his job. And so they bought Gaize because we can tell him if he was high at the time. And that's an incredibly important distinction between Gaize and every other test out there.
100%. And most industries are having difficulties finding good people.
Yeah.
So when you've got a good person and you're firing them for something that has nothing to do with work, potentially, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And the cost of onboarding a new employee or replacing that good employee versus the price of Gaize.
pretty easy math, I'll say that.
Absolutely. Do you mind sharing, without naming companies, of course, but the industries that you've had such a positive response with this?
You bet. The largest industry that we've had as customers so far is manufacturing. We've also got customers so far in mining, oil and gas. We're really interested in the employment space, so employment agencies are looking at Gaize, so we're excited about that use case. Construction is another one where we've had some success, and let's see, insurance. Really what I think those are the big ones, but really what I would say is that any industry that has employees that are safety sensitive, or job types that are really security sensitive potentially, or require a high degree of mental acuity, are good fits for our technology.
I like that. And what's the response been from law enforcement?
Law enforcement has this really pressing problem where they need to stop impaired driving, but they don't have an adequate tool to do that. There's, as I've said, not a simple test like a breathalyzer that you can use to detect active impairment. And in some states, they've actually gone further and really protected drivers who use cannabis by saying that officers can't perform additional screening based on seeing cannabis in the vehicle or smelling cannabis in the vehicle. And so that really puts law enforcement in a very difficult position. We are actively engaged with many different law enforcement agencies. We have 6 pilot deployments happening right now, some with very large departments that you've heard of and some with smaller departments. One we've been able to be public about is Warren County, Pennsylvania. They're using Gaize right now as a tool to help stop impaired drivers. And so we're really interested in solving this law enforcement use case. The sales cycles tend to be longer in law enforcement, so we're working through that process, and I think it'll all come together sometime, soonish. Hopefully we'll have law enforcement deploying Gaize in a community near you.
I love that. Well, and I think just knowing that for those people listening right now, right? I think people knowing that even law enforcement is trusting this process and moving forward, because this problem's for all of us, right?
Absolutely.
We legalized marijuana, and now what?
Yeah, and I mean, law enforcement is really an easier conversation in some respects because they're very familiar with the tests we're doing. They've been doing these tests for 45 years. And so when we go in and say, hey, we've got this product that's based on these tests you've been using, they very quickly understand the why behind it and are interested in moving forward with, how can we use this? Is this a good fit for our officers? What's the, legal ramifications? Where do we get the money? All that.
Well, and taking the subjectivity out of it and making it objective. Just like with employers, when we're talking about signs and symptoms, is it personal and I'm out to get you? Or is this really showing us what I think I see?
Yeah,
right?
Absolutely important point. Officers are criticized all the time, particularly in court, for being subjective and discriminatory. And Gaize really provides, I think, a way that they can offload some of that responsibility to a piece of technology that's not going to have the same sort of potential for bias. And it's not to say that I think officers are even, have a lot of bias. I think broadly officers try really, really hard to do a good job at this, and it's incredibly difficult work. And our product, I think, provides a lot of protection for the officers that are out doing that.
Yeah, I would agree. And I would also absolutely agree, in case that came out wrong, I think law enforcement does a great job. We are very pro-law enforcement. And however, public can say, oh, it's subjective, I'm targeted, whatever they may say, right? Yeah. And this just, again, same thing for the employers.
Yep.
It's not that. Here we've got some proof. Now let's take next steps, right?
Here's evidence of what your eyes were doing at the time of arrest, and we can see very clearly these symptoms of impairment that manifest in your eyes. And so this argument is now null.
Yeah. We're done with that one. Next. Yeah. Ken, where do you see kind of future workplace impairment, all of that? What do you see?
Yeah, as I look forward, we've got states that are starting to legalize other substances. Oregon's a good example. It's decriminalized all drugs. We've got MDMA that's in phase 3 clinical trials right now. Australia has recently legalized MDMA and psilocybin. We've got Colorado has legalized psilocybin. I think there are some other municipalities across the country that are working on the same. And so if I'm going to look at this, longer term, I think where we need to head as a company with Gaize is we need to make sure that our product can detect impairment from every class of drug. And so we're very aggressively moving in that direction, and we're actively capturing data right now on ketamine, for example. We're going to be doing some stimulant and opiate data capture this year. So what we are really working towards is a single product that can detect impairment from any class of drug. And it'll take us a little bit of time to get there, but I think that our product has the potential to do that, whereas really no other product does, because of how the eyes are directly linked to the brain, and how the brain responds to these drugs is very predictable.
That's great. Any last points on your side, Ken? Because I'm really excited to hear you and to work with you, and I just think it's a great product. But is there any last things you'd want to say to people about your product?
I don't think so, other than, I think it represents a real opportunity for cost savings as well. When you've got a first line of defense that costs you $0 per test and has zero consumables, that really, I think, presents a compelling way for businesses to test more frequently and in more situations. And so a good example that we always use is, hey, you might suspect you've got employees that are smoking pot in the parking lot at lunch. Well, now you can test some sample of them, or all of them potentially, when they come back from lunch every single day at no incremental cost to you. So I think that's a really interesting sort of paradigm shift that we often are trying to work our customers through. Hey, you're spending X on disposables and testing right now. You can probably shave that by at least a little bit by deploying Gaize and testing only those that are failing certain tests.
Great point. So Gaize is a one-time purchase. You might need to upgrade depending on what's going on with it, but you buy the device, and then all the tests are included, if you will, right? There's no
we don't
add-on fees.
Right. We don't have a per test fee. We have one annual fee that covers the whole thing, and it's pretty affordable for businesses. So we haven't had really any trouble in the pricing department so far, and I think it really represents an interesting new way for business to think about fitness for duty and making sure that their employees are ready to work every single day, and verifiably so.
That's great. And Ken, your website, because I will say to everybody watching this podcast that feel free to contact us at Protected at Work, or you can reach out to, what's your website, Ken? Yeah,
you bet. And thank you so much for the partnership, Linda. It's been really wonderful working with you and Nicole, and we're so happy to be part of the suite of things that you recommend at Protected at Work. Our website is Gaize, GAIZE.ai. So again, that's GAIZE.ai. And we are on all the social media. Feel free to give us a like and a follow, and touch base with any questions. Or touch base with Protected at Work. You're completely spun up on the product. You have one of our products, and we're very happy to have you out there demoing it for customers.
I do have the product, and we've taken the test, so I know how easy it is. I have clients of ours that own the product now that are thrilled about they're thrilled about the opportunity to treat their employees fairly, right? Yeah. Now, clearly, there are industries that people cannot use, period, right? Some of the all of the federally mandated ones, and there's some other exceptions in that. But for those non-regulated companies and employees and employers, I think this is just a great tool. So again, Fichtler from Gaize, please feel free to contact me, lhoney@protectedatwork.com, and we'll have links on this, I'm sure, as well. So thank you again for having us.
Thank you, Linda.